history of Athens is quite interesting because we have a cosmic battle between Poseidon and also Athena. According to the myth, this particular place is considered a sacred space. And the way that it was declared the name Athena was because there was a war between, not a war, but a vote between the people and who would choose their patron god. So Poseidon donated or created a well with salt water. And the people did not accept that because you can do really anything with salt water. But then Athena, she planted an olive tree. And the olive tree, you can do many things with the olive tree and the olive. So therefore they chose Athena as the patron goddess of the city of Athens. And here we have sacred space. They have minimum 7 temples on top of the Acropolis. And this would have been known in the ancient world as a cosmic mountain, in which the whole myth of Athena is based on the fact that it was a war and defeating all the gods and proclaiming victorious over the cosmic battles between all the gods of the pantheon. Well, that's why the Bible says that the God of Israel, he's the God of mountains, because he's the one who has dominion over the heavens and over the earth. That's why Genesis is written in that particular way. God created the heavens and the earth. No doubt that he has dominion over the seas. No doubt having dominion over Poseidon. To a Greek person, the message of the Bible, specifically in the book of Genesis, would have been very important, and they would have understood the message of sovereignty over creation. So study the ancient Near East, and you'll get more out of coming here in the Acropolis and understanding why it was built and how come it was preserved throughout the ages by other kingdoms, and usurping the authority by building churches during the Byzantine period and mosques during the Turk-Ottoman Empire. We're in the Acropolis in Athens, and this is one of the first things you encounter as you enter into the plaza. There's a little amphitheater here, and if you notice, I'm going to go a little close up. In the middle of it, you see those seats. That would have been reserved for the person of honor, proconsul, or anyone, a benefactor to the particular place. And if you notice, here at the bottom of the chairs, they have their names. And this is what first row seats look like in the time of the empire. And this is an important thing that we need to remember, because when it comes to the first century, patron-client relationship and also becoming a benefactor was important in society. And this is an example, a perfect example of how they used to value people who donated and was a benefactor to the city, and they honor them by giving them a chair or a seat, or in other places they give them a crown of honor bestowed upon them for the things they've done for the community or for whatever valor they've showed in war or in other things like that. At the foot of the mountain of the Acropolis, we have what is called the Temple of Asclepius, and this was more or less a hospital. It was very well known in the ancient world how Asclepius was the god of healing. It was represented by the serpent, as you can see right here. And it's very peculiar here in the Acropolis because it was a huge building, and it actually had rooms in which people could stay. We saw the same thing in Ephesus, and we also saw it in Rome. As a matter of fact, the way that Rome was established was based on the myth that the Romans came here, and they came to this particular temple. They took the serpent with them, and going up the river Tiber, the serpent jumped the ship and landed, actually swam to the little island in the middle of the Tiber River. Thus there was established Rome, and from there, there's a hospital even to this day. So the way they would do it, they would come here and they would try to seek out the favor through dreams and prophecies and divination to the god Asclepius, hoping to get a healing. And it's quite interesting that it's at the foot of the Acropolis of the goddess Athena. And imagine Paul coming through here. He's actually trying to make the contrast between the way of salvation of the God of Israel versus the way of salvation of the Greeks and the Romans. It's a perfect example of what Paul was encountering when he came here in Acts chapter 17. He actually noticed the amount of gods that were here. And by noticing the amount of gods that were here, now he's contrasting the plan of salvation of God through Yeshua the Messiah versus the mythology of the Greco-Roman world in the god Asclepius. Who is the real healer? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. in the first century, you can only imagine what Paul is dealing with coming here. This is the temple of Asclepius. And this is at the foot of the Acropolis. And on the other side, when we get to the Agora, you're going to notice how there are many temples. And Paul was actually in the Areopagus addressing all the pagan gods and how he serves the only one true God. What you see here on the screen right now, as you can see, the building of Asclepius. Please make the contrast between the God of salvation, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Yeshua, the Messiah's resurrection. And Paul would have been contrasting their concept of salvation and healing versus the concept of salvation of the God of Israel. Now, it's interesting that the word that Paul uses in Hebrews chapter 9:22, aphesis, that without the shedding of the blood there's no forgiveness, that word forgiveness is connected with healing. It's actually remission of a sickness there's no cure for. As we all know, death has no cure. So the God of Israel, through the resurrection, proved that Asclepius is not the true healer, is actually the God of Israel through the resurrection. The sickness no one can heal. And that's what they're seeking here. People with death, they were going to die, sickness, they will come here trying to seek visions and dreams to get healing. Well, the God of Israel kind of settled that through the resurrection of the Messiah. This is an example of what Paul would have contrasted the gospel message versus the way they lived. This is an amazing view of the Areopagus looking towards the Greek Agora, the marketplace. And I'm in the Acropolis right now. And this is what Paul would have looked at from that Mars Hill, that little rock, a huge rock right in front of you, would have been Mars Hill or the Areopagus that the book of Acts talks about, where Paul went in and he talked to the leadership in Athens about the gospel. He would have been looking towards either the Acropolis or the Greek Agora. And you see one of the temples, Temple of Athena here, I think it is, or Apollo, one of the two. And that would have been the city where they had over 8 temples and also the altar of the unknown gods. And once I get down there, I will tell you a little bit more about the inscription they found in Pergamum, I think it was, in regards to the altar of the unknown God. In Acts 17, Paul came to this place. He was actually teaching at the Bema, down at the bottom of the hill, where he was called to come here to the Areopagus. The Areopagus. What is the Areopagus in chapter 17? Let me give you some historical accounts. The Areopagus is a rocky outcrop, approximately 150 meters high. It was actually, they worship gods here too, but it's mainly a judicial body. The Areopagus Council met here on this hill to preside over cases of murder, sacrilege, and arson. And Paul was brought here because he was teaching about resurrection down in the Bema, which is all the way to the bottom near the Stoa that you see here to my right. And it's interesting because Paul's argument was about every temple. There were minimum 7 temples down there, the Agora plus the Acropolis, and they had at least 5 more temples at the Acropolis. So Paul understood their worship. It tells you in the book of Acts that he noticed everything they're worshiping around them. So when he came here, he understood the contrast between the God of Israel versus the God of the nations. And what's really peculiar is that Paul tells them, you know, the altar on the unknown God, well, that's the God I worship. It just so happened that they found an inscription of an altar of the unknown God in Pergamum, which tells me that they also had an altar of the unknown God here too, because that was prevalent throughout the Greco-Roman world. They worshiped the same gods. So Paul utilized what they knew, what they understood, and then he related in contrasting the God of Israel. You're worshiping everything, but the one that you're not worshiping, that's the one I worship. So it's interesting that we understand, interesting that we can connect the culture and the history to know what Paul was saying to the people here. By the way, these people were leaders, they were magistrates, they were judges, they were philosophers. He was speaking at a high level of Greek rhetoric, and understanding the literary genre of the first century will give you a greater insight into what Paul was conveying to them in the first century. I'm in the Roman Agora here in Athens, and I want to show you one of the entrance to the Roman Agora, not the Greek one, okay? And I want to give you some history as you look at the picture there, the view. Now, the archaeologists, they found a boundary stone. A boundary stone is, it delineates an entrance to the particular area. Now, what's really interesting is that if you know, you've been following my teachings anyway, anytime, you know that I talk about the caste system of Rome. So in the caste system, you have the plebeians, patricians, slaves, and then you have the freedmen. And what's interesting is that they found a boundary stone. In other words, a threshold in the Roman Agora, for as far as I know, that kids, little boys, slaves, and certain types of people were not allowed to enter. It was actually reserved for certain types. And that's quite interesting because you get an idea how the cultural function in the time of the Bible. You know, there was what you would call racism. It's more like social status. So to be a slave, you didn't have to be black. You know, anyone of any color could be a slave. It was even you went into debt and you have to pay your debt, so therefore you became a slave to pay your debt, or you were taken captive if the Romans conquer your tribe or your land. And here we see in the Agora from the Roman period, in the 1st century, by the way, and they had the Greek and they had the Roman Agora, which is the marketplace. So it gives you an idea of how their culture functioned. Every culture changes slightly, but the Romans and the Greeks, they, at one point or another, became so connected. It became very Hellenized. Even the Romans became very Hellenized in many ways. The influence was paramount of the Greco-Roman history because of the empire was so big. And you have Asia Minor, and then you have all of Greece and northern Greece, in which influenced a lot of the people within the Roman Empire. So it's quite interesting, and I thought I'd share that with you so you get an idea how things function in the 1st century. And it's just like when you go to a store and they have a sign, certain people are not allowed, same way. Okay, so consider it that way. Even to this day, we practice the same things.